So, a warm welcome from Helsinki, ladies and gentlemen. I am Alin, the convener of this academic event and the member of the Göttingen Coptic Old Testament team. Last month, on October 21, we had Alberto Camplani of the La Sapienza University of Rome, who talked about the Egyptian patriarchal institution. In case you missed the talk Alberto gave last month, the conference is now available on YouTube and you can search for it. Today, I have the honor and also the great pleasure to welcome Arietta Papaconstantinou, who is reader in classics at the University of Reading in the UK, and associate member of the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. Arietta took her PhD at the Université de Strasbourg in France with a thesis focusing on the cult of the saints in Egypt as reflected in the Greek papyri and inscriptions. An updated version of the thesis appeared in 2001 under the title Le culte des saints en Égypte des Byzantins aux Abbassides. The book is an enlarged version of the thesis because it takes into account also the Coptic hagiographic documentation, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it because it has become a basic tool for research on Christian Egyptian hagiography. Arietta has also co-edited several books, and she published a long list of articles on papyrological sources, late antiquity, and multilingualism in Egypt with prestigious publishing houses and in leading academic journals. She is well known, for example, for her contributions on the use of Greek and Coptic on the one hand and Coptic and Arabic on the other by the Christian communities in Egypt. She has several publications on this topic. She also published an important paper on Coptic hagiographical texts in the Ashgate Companion to Byzantine Hagiography, and is one of the most qualified scholars to talk about the topic that she will approach today. Before giving the word to Arietta, please allow me to inform you that next month, on December 16, we will be hearing a paper by our colleague and longtime collaborator, Paola Buzzi of the La Sapienza University of Rome, who will speak about the Turin Coptic papyri. Then next year, on January 20, we will organize a mini symposium which will include two papers on Coptic Christianity and literature of the Muslim period. We will have Mark Swanson of the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago talking about the golden age of the Coptic Arabic literature in the 13th century. And then Phoebe Armanios will give a paper on the Coptic Church and Coptic clergy during the Ottoman era, especially the revitalization of the Coptic religious life during the 17th and 18th centuries. Those of you who already wrote me about your intention to attend this lecture series, it's not necessary to register again, because I already have included you on my mailing list, and you will receive from now on a notification from me each time a new paper is scheduled. So now please make sure that you turn your microphone off, and without further delay, I give the floor to Arietta. Please, Arietta.
Okay, well, it's good to see everybody. It feels like, this makes up a bit for the Congress we missed this summer. Every Copticist from everywhere. So this work on, so you automatically assumed it is hagiography, which it is, of course, because biography and life writing in Coptic is overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, about, hagiography. But initially I was asked actually to write a chapter for the Oxford Handbook of Ancient Biography, by Kunde Temmerman. And I found that a rather challenging request because it was something that hasn't been looked at for Coptic literature until now, not in the form, at least in the form that the Temmerman was expecting, which was an analysis, a literary analysis of biography. And of course, as a genre, as a literary genre, biography is traditionally understood to be a narrative following one individual from, as they say, from the cradle to the grave, from birth to death. Though more recent literary approaches have insisted on other, much more fragmented forms of biographical writing. And initially this touched modern biography, classical literary history as well. And it was introduced, this approach was of biography as a kind of form of writing rather than just a genre, was introduced to the Middle Ages by Walter Berschin in 1986, and until 2004, Berschin published 5 volumes, actually 6 books, but 5 volumes because one is a double volume, called the Biographie und Epokenstil im lateinischen Mittelalter, covering the 3rd to the 13th century and taking what is mainly hagiographical texts into account. He used these forms and styles of biography as windows onto the broader sociocultural context of the times. Also introduced other forms of life writing in his survey, and that is where it can be interesting for us as well. Things from annals to laments for the dead to all sorts of other types of documents, even if this contained only fragments. Of course, Berschin had very lavish amounts of material to work with, medieval Latin literature, while Copticists only have, as Anne Boudor has memorably put it, shreds of literature. Still, I don't think it is entirely impossible to approach Coptic literary texts along the same lines. And I found it a useful angle of approach. So I'll take only some examples here for lack of time and just try to make some points. They come from a sort of overall attempt to classify the surviving texts primarily on the basis of their form and function, literary form and function, rather than that of their genesis or origin or language, for that matter. It's clear that despite their similarities and their usual grouping under the label hagiography, religious biographical texts are of a very diverse nature. And so are their literary forms. We have biographies proper, which can be either monastic life stories or biographies of bishops. We have martyrologies, and we also have texts containing more or less extensive sections that are distinctly biographic. Now, I'll start with the monastic life stories. Perhaps the only ones that are biographies in the traditional sense, from the cradle to the grave kind of stories. The origins of Christian biography, of course, are closely bound with the monastic movement, but like that movement, they can be, again, very diverse. We have individuals living alone with their demons, to group leaders creating new institutions, or advocates of resistance to authority. So the subjects treated called for stories with different focal points. For all these, Athanasius' Life of Antony, which is celebrated as as the earliest, perhaps, Christian biography, had an impressive afterlife if we judge not only by the number of manuscripts, but also by its impact on later Christian biographical writing. The description of an individual's quest for liberation from human passions, using the theme of repeated, ultimately unsuccessful attacks by demons in order to highlight the strength of the ascetic's resolution and faith, has become one of the stock motifs of monastic biography to this day, I would say. Authors of later ascetic lives used these themes creatively, introduced their own or their variations of it. Wanting to imitate Antony as a reason for becoming a monk was one of the most durable topoi of monastic literature. My first example for in this area will be Pachomius, the focus of perhaps the most important biographical dossier that has come down to us from late antique Egypt. There are extant today several texts in Greek and in Coptic, with a complex and partly still unclear textual history. I will use the Bohairic life largely because it is the most complete and detailed. So we are told why this life is written, right? It appeared that through his progress, Pachomius became a perfect monk. We ought therefore, to recount all the details of his life from childhood. This is what the standard motivation for writing biography from Plutarch and many others onwards. It is to show the example of a perfect person. It begins in the shadow of the life of Antony, setting up Pachomius as someone with a very similar vocation, who left home to find an anchorite, Palamon, to initiate him to the ascetic life. The foundation of koinonia was based on a strict set of rules, is not presented in the life as the initial aim of Pachomius, but rather as the result of the difficulties that arose when an important following had gathered around him and needed direction. Now, this presentation legitimizes and justifies the existence of the rules, reasserts the community's adhesion to those rules. In that sense, we can say that the lives are inseparable from the other pieces of the dossier, which contains the rules and a number of letters. They all hang together and explain each other in a way. Now, the life's self-referential account of how it came to be shows very clearly that the veneration of the founder held the community together, and that his words and deeds acquired the quality of communal memory. So the second passage here, listen to me, my brothers, understand well the things I'm telling you, for the man whom we are exalting is truly the father of us all, after God. He is also one of the holy men of God, and one who did his will always and everywhere. And that's it's from here that it's interesting for what I'm trying to say. I am fearful that we may forget his labors and actually be unmindful of who it was who made this multitude one spirit and one body. It was it was accomplished by means of him and of our other holy fathers who aided him in the establishment of this holy institution. Now then, let us not be negligent and forget his laws and his commandments, which he gave us while he was still with us in the body. So a bit further, this is Theodore, his successor, addressing the community. A bit further, he continues, pay attention to the words I'm speaking to you, because a time is coming when you will not be able to find anyone able to recount them for you. At Theodore's death, the new head of the community makes the same point while addressing the monks. Now then, my beloved brothers, let us always remember his labors and his practices, and the tears which he shed in the Lord's presence, and day and night on our behalf, that this word of scripture may not apply to us. They quickly forgot his deeds and did not keep his counsels. So we're talking about memory and forgetting, and with a quote from the Psalms. Now, this insistence of the biographer on living memory and on the genealogical continuity of the leaders of the community with the founder highlights the role of the biographies as foundational and institutional narratives, shaping the group's historical definition and reinforcing its feeling of common identity. I note anyone able to recount them for you who has a link, a direct link to Pachomius. And this oneness of the community made the multitude one spirit and one body. From the late 5th century, we know monastic biographies started participating in the Christological debates as well. There is quite a lot to say here and a lot of material, but I'll pass. Just to take a second example, which is arguably the last of the series of monastic biographies still obsessed with Chalcedon, and that is the life of Samuel of Calamun. The narrator, Isaac, explains his motive for writing the life and says that it is because some God-loving men and holy elders urged him to. And the reason is, again, very similar to Pachomius, we realize, that is because there is a direct living memory. They also, our holy fathers, heard from their fathers who were before them, and they heard from their fathers who were the disciples of the Great One, Abba Samuel. And furthermore, those who have seen with their eyes and heard with their ears, their hands have touched him. So there is this kind of direct relation, confirmed in their belief about everything that happened to the righteous one, etc., etc. And again, a quote from the Psalms. And it does have this passage, at whose feet we sat and who told us everything. So this kind of human chain of storytelling, if you like, very much like the same function in many ways as the isnad. In the Islamic historiography, you have to have a direct line that goes back to the original figure. So this biography starts in the original, in the usual way, describes its childhood, vocation, departure to join a monastery. When something happens, then a letter from Heraclius on the doctrine of one energy comes. Samuel tears it up, brands it as the Tome of Leo, and is expelled from Scetis, and after a number of adventures ends up in the abandoned monastery, in the abandoned Calamun, where he founds a monastery, reassured by an angel. So this, again, we see is a text that, among other things, is a foundational narrative for a community and is part of the historical memory of that community. Its foundation is construed as a heroic act of anti-Chalcedonian defiance sanctioned by God himself, who sends the angel for help and reassurance. I'll move to biographies of bishops who are, to a large extent, a sort of subcategory of the monastic vita, largely because bishops are initially monks, or at least their biographies are developed as monastic biographies initially. They cannot be reduced to that, however, because they also integrate political elements, referred to the administration of an episcopal see. Now, from late antique Egypt, from medieval Egypt for that matter, the only see to have produced a complete set of biographies of its occupants, of course, is the See of Alexandria. The well-known, I don't know to everybody, but the Coptic ecclesiastical history, after the part which is takes up Eusebius, continued proceeding bishop by bishop, and ultimately form the basis of the early sections of what came to be known as the history of the Patriarchs of Alexandria. Now, Johannes and Heyer's and Perrin Pilet's work on this text and its different redactions has clarified many aspects of this very complex textual history. And I won't go into that. What I want to look at is rather the fact that its role as biographies, its role as a biography of an institution, or a series of biographies linked to an institution. They probably started being collected as a continuous narrative for the history of the sea at some point. Presumably, some of them existed already independently and must have been cut or edited to go into the series. Others may have been written especially for that. It's really hard to know. But because of their different authors and dates of composition, the different periods described, but also of the personalities, different personalities of the bishops, the biographies of the history of the patriarchs are varied in length, style, and content. On the whole, even though many have motives from the monastic lives that we know, their genre is much more that of life and times. So they describe or they insist quite heavily on the political, historical developments of each bishop's tenure. In that sense, they're much closer to the genre of what is known as basileia, which is political history written through the biographies of kings. Through their collection and presentation in a continuous way, they created an institutional memory that became the received version of the history of the Coptic Church. The importance, and again, we come back to the question of community, even if it's not an internal community like monastic communities, but one that goes out at large. The Bishop of Alexandria as a head of a community, it becomes very clear at several points in the history, but I just take one example here. Where the heads of the two Christian denominations are before Abu al-Hussein, a Muslim judge. An old man, tranquil, not given to showing favor to anyone, nor to taking bribes. And that's under Michael I. He was wise in his discourse and just in his judgments, etc. And at the beginning of his judgment, he said, "Which among you is the father of the Jacobites?" And they presented Abba Michael and said, "Behold him here." And then he said, "Who is the father of the Melkites?" And they showed him the other one. So again, the bishop presented as the head of a community and the kind of focal point of that community, representative in this case. I shall now pass to a third category, which is perhaps less biographic in the traditional sense, but still focuses on one individual and their and part of their life. Let's say it's a partial biography. Very clearly a very popular genre, as we all know. On the whole, Coptic martyr stories fall into the same categories as Greek or Latin ones, either acts, more or less sober accounts of trial and execution, or passions, which are romanticized tales extolling the hero's virtue, strength, capacity for resistance. They're not strictly speaking, as I was saying, biographies from birth to death, but they are very often directly inspired by the biographical form in their writing, even if they only focus on the last part of the subject's life, generally from the moment when they become involved with the persecution. So it kind of picks up the life halfway. An example of the presentation of the central character, I've given this one here from the Martyrdom of Paese and Thecla. So this is Paese. And this is very classic in the reign of Diocletian. The lawless emperor, there was in the Thebaid a man north of Schmun, etc. So what I'll pass on the details. This narrative structure is always very predictable and always similar. The narration starts with Diocletian's edict, discusses how it came to Egypt, then jumps with very little by way of transition to the presentation of the martyr, whose story is about to be told. And this presentation, just like here, consists of some very basic information, describing more or less briefly their place of origin, their family, their lifestyle, and their good deeds. He was wont to assign 100 sheep for wool for the widows and orphans and the poor and destitute who were in his village. They all did very good things before they became martyrs. Now, various types of transition allow the narrator then to make sure the martyr is found out by the persecutors, sometimes because the martyr goes and seeks the persecutors out. The main body of the narration consists of a confrontation with a local persecutor, not prosecutor. Now, the main, asked to sacrifice, the martyr resists, provokes the fury of the persecutor, is painstakingly tortured, long passages of gory descriptions, healed by an angel, etc., etc. Going back, being re-tortured, re-healed. And this, of course, has made some Bollandists show irony about how full of commonplaces and how these stories defied common sense. But the implication of a story like this is, of course, that the death is voluntary and accepted after having shown that they can survive all these tortures, that they do not die like normal people die because an angel helps them. Then they just stick out their head and let it be cut. Right? So it does make a point, even if it makes it in a very roundabout way. Now, all these elements that I don't know if everybody here has read Delay's article on Coptic martyrs, but there are, I think there is, it has influenced the way people look at Coptic martyr literature for many, many years. Now, these narratives, of course, have this element of exaggeration, but what it does, it brings these martyrologies closer to entertainment literature than any other form of hagiography. And this is true of not only Coptic ones, by the way. Martyrdoms are the type of narratives that Umberto Eco describes in his Il Superuomo di Massa, which is a difficult term to translate, the mass superhuman, the mass superman. An invariable, how he describes this is that it's stories that have an invariable basic structure with a Manichaean ideology built around elementary oppositions, where the pleasure does not come from the incredible and the new, but from the obvious and the usual. A literature whose function is to restate and reaffirm the validity of a cultural system of expectations, and whose appeal is principally the return of the déjà vu. More precisely, its cyclical return, not only in a single work, but in a series of comparable narratives. Now, of course, Umberto Eco was talking about 19th century superuomo literature, of the great heroes of 19th century literature, but it applies perfectly well, this kind of analysis applies perfectly well to martyrological literature. The focus of these texts on an individual and their assumption of the biographic form helps them fulfill this function through their identification with the hero and the values the hero represents. So the public, despite being primarily entertained, gradually acquire a sense of common identity and shared values, those of those heroes. And a bit like fairy tales, these narratives help create and maintain forms of social memory. Now, if we see the stories in this light, what was felt as gory and repulsive by Deleuze, who called this des boucheries répugnantes, repulsive butcheries, can instead be understood as grotesque and intended to amuse or the audience or create suspense. Some of the scenes described come very close to modern slapstick comedy even. I'll give just one example from the Martyrdom of Chenuf and his brethren. It befell that when she had said this, she's being tortured. The governor was angry and caused her belly and her breast to be cleft open, and he had pepper and salt and mustard and acrid vinegar brought, of all things. And he had them applied to her belly and breasts, and through the power of God, her breasts ceased bleeding, and they issued forth milk and sprinkled the tormentors who were torturing her. One can picture this scene of these people trying to torture a woman and cutting her to pieces, and all of a sudden kind of being sprayed by milk coming out. This is something that, even though it isn't a theatrical performance like these slapstick comedies that we see today, such readings were very, very powerfully performative and conjured up all this universe of images that could go from the sublime to the grotesque in a bid to keep the audience's attention. And I shall finally look at my last category, which has subcategories, which I call fragments of life writing. But the first series, I'll just take three because there are many fragments of life writing a bit everywhere, but encomia are perhaps the most obvious, and the one I will deal with a bit less because they are well known. They have biographic elements when they're talking about individuals, but the encomium of individuals always have a part of biography. The encomium of Antony by John of Schmoon, which is a very textbook piece of epidictic rhetoric, weaving information from the life by Athanasius to extol the virtues of Antony as a symbol of holiness, not only of himself, but also of the land of Egypt. The encomium of Coluthos by Isaac of Antinoe, for example, although it's only preserved in fragments, must have contained a rather substantial biographical account, because there is one fragment narrating his childhood. So this is perhaps the most obvious genre where we have biographical fragments. Another group which I find more original are what one might call the mini vitae, or sub-vitae, you could call that. These are life narratives that are embedded in longer narratives, longer biographies or other texts, and introduce one of the characters of the subject's entourage in general. A very interesting example is that of Theodore the Alexandrian in the Boheric life of Pachomius. Now, Theodore is a character described as a central figure in the overall organization of the community under Pachomius and his successor, Theodore. He's presented as a young man from a pagan family of Alexandria who wanted to become a monk. Eventually, he becomes the community's chief interpreter and head of the house of the Greek speakers. Now, this relatively short narrative starts in the standard form of a monastic biography, especially until Theodore joins the monastery of Pachomius. The sections that follow once he is at the monastery, although still telling Theodore's story, are subordinated to the master narrative of Pachomius's life, in such a way that Theodore's life becomes a sub-narrative, evolving always in a dialectical relation with the main narrative line. This extract, for example, thanks to his steadfastness and to his intelligence, Theodore understood the Egyptian language. He learned it when he went there. At the time when our father Pachomius was speaking the word of God to the brothers, Theodore would hear from his mouth. Then, on returning to his house, he would repeat in Greek to those he served as interpreter. Like a nurse comforting her children, he comforted them with the words of life of our father Pachomius, with which he instructed them and which he recommended they put into practice and keep carefully, etc. Now, the thread of Theodore's life is entirely interwoven with that of Pachomius. He is almost Pachomius's linguistic mirror figure. He communicates through his master's words, but instead of his own, but simply in another language. In this sense, Theodore's life story serves to enhance the authority of and stature of Pachomius. It is also a life story that, just like those of other disciples and his two successors, remains incomplete, as the master narrative ends with the death of Pachomius and its aftermath. The establishment of his succession, and in the end, the life of his disciple, of Theodore, remains open. And finally, I wanted to look at an unexpected, perhaps more unexpected place where biographical fragments crop up, which are deeds and documents. Even though well, as far as we know, at least, Coptic literature did not produce full biographies of secular individuals, we do, very paradoxically perhaps, have life fragments from the man and the woman in the street, preserved in papyri. Now, this is principally the case in private legal documents that describe the circumstances that brought them into being. Wills, inheritance, and divorce settlements, other types of private documents, contain passages that narrate episodes or even summarize essential aspects of the life of the parties. Apart from the standard information about one's family that comes in the preamble of some documents, they are the father of so-and-so and whatever, the narrations can give many personal biographical details. For example, the will of Elizabeth from the 8th century. From Jeme. Gosh, I didn't put that there. So in those troubled years that have passed, you, my husband Abraham, went south to Saini, your city. You sold your house, the one that came to you from your parents. You received 57 solidi of gold. You brought them to me with your entire wealth, the entire wealth of your parents, including iron and bronze, etc., etc. We received them together, me with you, and Maria, my mother. She had become old. And Georgios, the one whom I bore with my first husband, Lule, etc. So you have a whole narration that gives you a lot of information on the person's life, even though you don't get any context right and left to see where there is a kind of thread that links this information to the issue at hand, which is her will and why she's giving what she's giving to him rather than to others. So it's only selected information, but it is very, very detailed information. Again, another example which many of you know, or at least I have written on quite at length, are the various transfers of ownership of children to the monastery of St. Phoibamon in Western Thebes. Again, these contain narrative sections of different lengths, describing why the parents are giving this child and giving a story which is generally the story of that child and how the situation came to this document, why the child is being given. So you have very often a wish for a child, a vow made to the monastery to give the child if you get it, and then breaking a vow, the saint helping, etc., etc., helping when the vow is broken, the child becomes ill, the saint cures the child, and then the child is given anyway, despite the first hesitation. so these stories vary from one document to the other, of course, but again, I'm not going to go into technical aspects of the documents, but from the point of view of biographical writing, these texts have an immediacy and an authenticity that literary compositions lack. Above all, they're written in the first person, which is really interesting because they constitute, in that sense, the very rare examples of autobiographic writing in Coptic. Even though the actual text was not really written by the parents, but was written by a notary or a scribe who drew up the document, and according to models that existed, they still retain, in terms of purely of form, they retain a form of writing that is in the first person and that is biographic. So it gives a sense of how it would have been, how an autobiographical text could have looked. So to conclude, I'll just make some general remarks. This doesn't exhaust, of course, at all the subject of Coptic life writing. An analysis along those lines, however, can open new avenues for the study of Coptic literature. On the whole, the rise of the biographic form that has been noted more generally for late antiquity, it takes off in the early imperial period, but but in late antiquity it explodes largely because of religious biographies. It is greatly felt in Coptic texts, probably even more strongly than in other languages, as a proportion, at least as a proportion of the overall literary production. The impulses that we found that existed behind, let's say, classical biography are still present. That is, biographies, even though they have changed in style and in focus, etc., they are still used to do what Plutarch's biographies were doing, or earlier biographies, that is, define morality, provide examples, obtain adherents, persuade, justify, or legitimize. We find a wide range of admirable individuals, from the self-denying exemplum to the incredible superhero whose adventures inspired a mix of entertainment, suspense, or fear. One of the literary characteristics of these stories, in terms of biographical writing, is the lack of individuality of the characters. The characterization is really very basic. Just enough is said to make characters recognizable in the narrative, but even that is chosen among a set of normative virtues rather than being an attempt at individualization, as we call it in the modern sense, where you get a kind of psychological portrait. Rather, the stress of these stories is on the authority embedded in a number of exemplary individuals. And the true source of that authority comes from conformity to a model and a sense of received criteria. So the cultural role of these stories, life stories, for Coptic self-perception was certainly enormous. The history of the community is constructed as the succession of the actions of great men and a handful of women, a very small handful. And from the level of the village or monastic community to that of the Coptic church community as a whole, these stories were read, heard, discussed, and repeated, creating overlapping forms of communal historical identity and reasserting values of cultural values and social cohesion.